This is HOA Justice Stories. They wanted control. I will make sure the vendor sees this. That is what Pamela Mitchell screamed at me while waving a laminated policy sheet between us like a shield, standing on the clubhouse steps with a bundle of zip ties clutched in her other hand like she was about to deploy a sign stand for maximum enforcement theater. She screamed that she had an incident number, and that made her untouchable. The tow truck driver stood 10 feet behind her with his arms crossed, not moving, visibly uncomfortable. I had 5 minutes before the tow hook touched my truck, and the HOA started charging me daily storage fees, on top of the violation fine they claimed I owed. Pamela is the Canyon Springs Association Landscaping Committee lead here in Billings, Montana. She has been sending me red-stamped final notice envelopes for 3 weeks, each one arriving the morning after another confrontation, and I still do not know what violation I supposedly committed. My lease addendum ties me to HOA compliance, so if they build a violation record against me, my landlord can terminate. That is the stakes. I work as a UPS-style delivery driver, long shifts, and I come home to this. Pamela jabbed a finger toward my truck and said the tow was authorized under Section 4.3. I asked her to show me the violation notice. She said she already sent it. I pulled out my phone and opened the portal screenshot showing 0 unread messages and 0 active violations. She glanced at it and said, "Your camera does not matter. My minutes are the truth." The tow driver shifted his weight and said he needed proper authorization in writing before he could proceed. Pamela spun toward him and said she was the committee lead, and her word was authorization enough. He shook his head and said his company requires a signed work order from the management office, not a board member acting alone. She told him to call his supervisor. He did. 2 minutes later, he told Pamela his supervisor needed the work order emailed before he could hook anything. Pamela turned back to me and said this was a delay tactic, and I would be charged for the truck roll anyway. I let her talk, because every word was helping me. I had been gathering proof for 2 weeks, ever since I found an old board packet in the clubhouse trash bin with tabs that should not exist. One tab was labeled Compliance Enforcement, another was labeled Vendor Coordination, and a third had a sticky note with my address and a date from 6 months before I even moved in. That packet should not have existed. The HOA gave me a cure deadline that expires tonight, and they threatened daily fines starting tomorrow. But the portal has no record of what I am supposed to cure. The HOA insists the only appeal method is the portal, and the portal conveniently breaks every time I try to upload a dispute. Pamela has been leaking selective screenshots to the neighborhood group chat to control the narrative, painting me as a repeat offender from a prior case I never had. Yesterday, she posted a claim that I damaged common property and must pay immediately or be charged daily. I have never damaged anything. The tow driver walked back to his truck without hooking mine. Pamela shouted after him that she would report him. He waved without turning around and drove off. She turned to me and said, "You can be mad, or you can be compliant." That is her catchphrase. She has said it to me at least twice before, once when she accused me of parking in a guest spot overnight, and once when she said my patio furniture violated the architectural guidelines. Both times the violation disappeared from the record after I challenged it. This time felt different. This time she was coordinating with someone inside management to make sure nothing I submitted ever showed up in the system. I asked her again to show me the written violation. She said it was in the minutes from the last meeting. I said I'd checked the minutes and my address was not mentioned. She said I must have looked at the wrong draft. I went back to the clubhouse that evening and pulled the board packet I had saved from the trash. It had minutes dated 8 months ago with a section about establishing a compliance task force. Pamela Mitchell was listed as the chair. The task force was authorized to coordinate directly with vendors for enforcement actions, bypassing the normal management approval process. That explained the tow attempt. The packet also had a ledger printout listing violation fees by address. My address appeared 3 times with dates that predated my move-in. Each entry had a fee amount and a note saying paid by prior owner, but the total balance column still showed the fees as outstanding. Someone had been double billing, and when I moved in, they tried to collect again by targeting me with new violations that mirrored the old ones. I took photos of every page with my phone. My friend in IT, who I met through a mutual contractor gig, verified the metadata and timestamps to confirm the documents were genuine and not edited. He also pulled the portal audit log using a records request trick he knew from his compliance work. The log showed that every dispute I uploaded in the last 3 weeks had been marked as spam by a management account and auto-deleted before it ever reached the board review queue. That same management account belonged to someone named Brenda Holloway, the assistant manager who reported directly to Pamela on landscaping enforcement. The neighborhood group chat exploded the next morning with a post from Pamela saying I had been issued a final warning for repeated non-compliance and that enforcement would proceed unless I paid within 24 hours. She attached a screenshot of a violation summary that listed 4 separate charges. I had never seen any of those charges in the portal. I replied in the chat with a screenshot of my portal showing 0 violations. Within seconds, 3 neighbors reacted with the laughing emoji. One neighbor, a guy named Rick, who always stood with his arms crossed and a smirk during confrontations, commented, "Same thing happened to me last year. They made it disappear after I threatened to lawyer up." Pamela deleted the entire thread 5 minutes later and posted a new message saying the chat was for community announcements only and disputes must go through the portal. I filed a formal records request with the management office asking for all board minutes, ledger entries, and violation notices associated with my address for the past 2 years. The response came back 3 days later, a single-page letter saying records prior to my tenancy were not available to non-owners. I escalated to the regional supervisor of the management company with a copy of the packet I found in the trash and the portal audit log. I attached a note saying the assistant manager had been systematically deleting resident disputes and that the board was authorizing enforcement actions that violated their own bylaws. The regional supervisor called me 2 days later and said they were launching an internal audit and that all pending violations against my address were suspended pending review. Pamela showed up at my door that evening with a clipboard and a red-stamped final notice envelope. She handed it to me and said the suspension did not apply because this was a new violation unrelated to the prior ones. I opened the envelope. The notice said I had placed unauthorized landscaping rocks in the common area and must remove them within 48 hours or be fined $200. I walked outside with her and asked her to show me the rocks. She pointed to a small decorative border along the sidewalk that had been there when I moved in. I told her the rocks were installed by the prior owner. She said it did not matter because they were still a violation and I was responsible as the current occupant. I took a photo of the rocks in the notice. She said photography was not allowed during an enforcement action. I ignored her and kept shooting. Rick walked over from across the street and said, "I remember those rocks. They have been there for at least 3 years. I installed the same kind last summer and nobody said anything." Pamela turned to him and said his opinion was not relevant. He laughed and said, "You are going to lose this one just like you lost the parking spot case last year." She told him to leave or she would file a harassment complaint. He stayed put, arms crossed, smirking. Pamela turned back to me and said I had 48 hours and walked off. Rick waited until she was out of earshot and said, "You need to check the title report. I bet those rocks are on the original approved site plan. If they are, she cannot touch them." I drove to the county records office the next morning and pulled the recorded plat and the original HOA site plan. The rocks were clearly marked on the approved landscaping diagram as a permanent decorative border along the common area edge. The diagram was dated 15 years ago and signed by the developer and the original HOA board. I made copies and brought them back to the clubhouse. I found Pamela in the meeting room setting up for a landscaping committee session. I handed her the copies and said the rocks were part of the approved site plan, and removing them would actually be a violation of the original design. She glanced at the papers and said the plat was outdated, and the current rules superseded it. I said the rules could not supersede a recorded easement or a developer-approved permanent installation. She said it was not an easement issue. I pulled out my phone and showed her the recorded plat with the easement line clearly marked 2 feet away from the rocks, proving the rocks were on private lot property, not common area. She stared at the screen for 3 seconds and then said the committee would review it and respond in writing. The written response never came. Instead, the HOA posted a notice in the clubhouse lobby announcing an emergency rules hearing to address unapproved landscaping installations. The hearing was scheduled for 5 days later, during my normal work shift. I requested a reschedule through the portal. The request was marked as received but never answered. I called the management office and got Brenda Holloway, the assistant manager. She said hearing schedules were set by the board and could not be changed for individual convenience. I said the bylaws required reasonable accommodation for work schedules. She said the bylaws also required residents to prioritize HOA compliance over personal obligations. I asked to speak to her supervisor. She said the supervisor was unavailable and hung up. I called the regional supervisor directly and left a voicemail explaining the situation. He called back an hour later and said the emergency hearing had been canceled and replaced with a standard agenda item at the next monthly board meeting, which was open to all residents and scheduled for a Saturday morning. He also said Brenda Holloway was being reassigned pending the outcome of the audit and that all enforcement actions related to landscaping were frozen until the audit was complete. I asked him if the freeze included the rocks notice. He said yes, everything was frozen, and I should receive written confirmation within 24 hours. The confirmation arrived the next day by certified mail. Pamela left another red-stamped final notice envelope on my door that same afternoon, claiming I had failed to respond to a records request she allegedly sent 2 weeks ago. I had never received any records request from her. I opened the envelope. The notice said I was required to provide copies of all communications with the management company and the regional supervisor within 72 hours, or face a $500 obstruction fine. It was signed by Pamela Mitchell as Landscaping Committee Chair. The notice cited a bylaw section that gave the committee authority to compel document production during an active investigation. I checked the bylaws that night. The section she cited existed, but it applied only to investigations of property damage or safety violations, and it required a board vote to invoke. There had been no board vote. The notice was bogus. I scanned it and forwarded it to the regional supervisor, with a note saying Pamela was continuing enforcement actions in direct violation of the freeze order. He replied within an hour saying he would address it immediately, and that I should not comply with the notice. Pamela called me 2 days later and said the committee hearing was rescheduled as a private session and my attendance was mandatory. I said the freeze was still in effect, and I would not attend any hearing until the audit was complete. She said the freeze applied only to new violations, not to ongoing investigations. I said there was no ongoing investigation because the rocks were on the approved site plan. She said the site plan was not relevant because the recorded plat did not show the rocks as an easement feature. I reminded her that I had already shown her the plat proving the rocks were on private lot property, She said I was misinterpreting the plat and she had consulted with the HOA attorney who confirmed the rocks were a violation. I asked her to provide the attorney opinion in writing. She said attorney work product was privileged and not subject to disclosure. I asked her for the attorney name so I could verify the consultation. She refused and hung up. I went back to the county office and pulled the full title report from my address. The report included a legal description that explicitly listed the decorative rock border as a permanent appurtenance to the lot. It also included a note from the title company confirming that the border had been in place continuously since the original subdivision was recorded. I made copies and sent them to the regional supervisor with a cover note saying Pamela was fabricating an attorney consultation to justify an enforcement action that contradicted the recorded title. He called me back and said the audit had uncovered irregularities in the landscaping committee records and that Pamela would be removed from her committee chair role pending a board review. He also said the management company was terminating their contract with Brenda Holloway effective immediately for policy violations related to records handling. Pamela posted in the neighborhood group chat that evening saying the audit was a witch hunt orchestrated by problem residents who refused to follow the rules. She did not name me, but she included a screenshot of a violation summary listing my address with 4 charges. The screenshot was identical to the one she had posted weeks earlier, which I had already proven was fabricated. Rick replied immediately saying, "You already posted that fake screenshot and deleted it when people called you out. Why are you posting it again?" Pamela deleted his comment and banned him from the chat. He sent me a direct message saying, "She is panicking. That is when people make mistakes. Keep pushing." Another neighbor, a woman named Sandra who had been quiet until now, messaged me privately and said, "I had the same thing happen last year." She tried to fine me for unapproved patio furniture, and when I challenged it, she claimed the violation notice was sent, but the portal ate it. I filed a complaint with the board and she backed off. You should talk to the board president directly. He is not part of her crew. I called the board president, a retired engineer named Tom Carlisle, and explained the situation. He listened without interrupting and then said, "I have been hearing similar complaints about Pamela for months, but every time I ask for documentation, the trail disappears. If you have proof, I need you to bring it to the next board meeting and present it on the record. That way we can take action without it turning into a he said, she said. The meeting is this Saturday at 10. Can you make it?" I said yes. He said, "Good. Bring everything. Printed copies, screenshots, the works. Do not rely on the projector, because Pamela will find a way to sabotage it." I spent the next 2 days organizing the evidence into a binder. I included the old board packet from the trash, the portal audit log, the certified freeze letter, the fake records request notice, the title report, the recorded plat, the landscaping site plan, and screenshots of every group chat post Pamela had made and then deleted. My IT friend verified the metadata for every document and printed a summary sheet showing the creation dates and modification history. He also prepared a 1-page explainer showing how the portal auto-delete function worked and how Brenda Holloway had abused it. I printed 3 copies of the full binder, one for me, one for Tom Carlisle, and one for the board secretary. If you are enjoying this story, hit that like button and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Saturday morning I arrived at the clubhouse 30 minutes early. The parking lot was already half full. I saw Rick and Sandra in the lobby along with a half-dozen other neighbors I recognized from the group chat. Rick waved me over and said, "Word got out that you are presenting evidence against Pamela. People want to see it." Tom Carlisle came out of the meeting room and said, "We are going to do open forum first, then regular business, then your presentation. That way everyone gets a chance to speak before things get heated." I nodded and took a seat in the second row. Pamela walked in 5 minutes later with her clipboard and a stack of papers. She sat in the front row and did not look at me. The meeting started with the open forum. 3 neighbors spoke about unrelated issues: a broken gate, a street light out, and a complaint about noise from the pool. Then Sandra stood up and said, "I want to talk about selective enforcement." Last year I was threatened with a fine for patio furniture that had been approved 3 years earlier. When I challenged it, the violation disappeared from the system and I never got an explanation. I know I am not the only one this has happened to. We need transparency in how violations are issued and tracked. Tom Carlisle thanked her and asked if anyone else had similar concerns. 2 more neighbors raised their hands and shared nearly identical stories: fabricated violations, missing portal records, and red-stamped final notice envelopes that arrived without warning. Pamela did not turn around. She wrote on her clipboard the entire time. Tom called for regular business and ran through the standard reports. Then he said, "We have a special presentation from a resident regarding compliance and records concerns." I stood up and walked to the front with my binder. I handed copies to Tom and the secretary and kept one for myself. I opened to the first page and said, "I am here because I have been targeted with multiple fabricated violations over the past month. I have documentation showing that these violations were created outside the normal process, that my disputes were deleted before reaching the board, and that the landscaping committee chair coordinated with a management employee to suppress my appeals." I flipped to the portal audit log and explained how the auto-delete function worked. Several neighbors leaned forward to look at the printouts Tom was holding. Pamela stood up and said, "This is a baseless accusation, and I will not sit here and be slandered." Tom said, "You will have a chance to respond. Let him finish." She sat back down but kept her clipboard clutched to her chest. I continued to the next section and showed the old board packet I found in the trash. I pointed out the tabs and the sticky note with my address predating my move-in. I said, "This packet shows that someone was tracking my address for enforcement before I even lived here. That suggests this was not about legitimate violations. It was about creating a paper trail to justify fees that were already in the system from a prior billing error." I flipped to the ledger printout and showed the double billing entries. Tom looked at the secretary and said, "Do we have an explanation for this?" The secretary shook her head and said, "I have never seen that ledger format. That is not from our current system." I flipped to the title report and the recorded plat and explained the rocks issue. I said the landscaping committee issued a violation for rocks that are on the approved site plan and recorded as a permanent appurtenance. When I provided proof, the committee chair claimed the plat was irrelevant and cited a consultation with the HOA attorney. I asked for the attorney opinion in writing and was told it was privileged. I reached out to the attorney office listed in the HOA directory and they confirmed they were never consulted about this issue. Tom looked at Pamela and said, "Is that true?" Pamela said, "I consulted with an attorney. It was a private consultation, not through the HOA account." Tom said, "Then it is not an HOA attorney opinion, and you cannot cite it as authority for a committee action." Pamela said nothing. I flipped to the freeze letter from the regional supervisor and the fake records request notice that Pamela left on my door afterward. I said, "After the management company ordered a freeze on all landscaping enforcement, the committee chair left this notice demanding I provide copies of my communications with the management company or face a $500 fine." The bylaw section she cited requires a board vote to invoke and only applies to safety investigations. There was no board vote and no safety issue. This was retaliation for escalating to the regional supervisor. Tom took the notice and read it. He looked at Pamela and said, "Did the board authorize this notice?" Pamela said, "The committee has independent enforcement authority under the bylaws." Tom said, "Not for document production. That requires a board vote. You overstepped." I closed the binder and said, I am not asking for an apology. I am asking for two things. First, I want all fabricated violations removed from the system and a written confirmation that my record is clear. Second, I want the board to implement a rule change so that residents cannot be railroaded by enforcement actions that bypass normal procedures. Every violation notice should go through the portal with a timestamp and a cure period before any escalation. No more red-stamped envelopes showing up without warning. No more auto-delete functions controlled by management staff. Tom nodded and said, "We will vote on both requests today. But first, I want to hear from the committee chair." Pamela stood up and said, "Everything I did was within my authority as committee chair. This resident has been uncooperative from the start and has used procedural loopholes to avoid accountability. The violations are legitimate and the evidence he is presenting is taken out of context." Rick stood up from the back and said, "That is not true. I watched her try to tow his truck without a work order. The tow driver refused because she did not have proper authorization. That is not legitimate enforcement. That is harassment." Sandra stood up and said, "She did the same thing to me last year. Fabricated a violation, deleted my portal uploads, and then acted like I was the problem when I pushed back." Another neighbor stood up and said, "I got one of those red-stamped envelopes last month for a garbage can violation that was never in the portal. When I called the office, they had no record of it." Tom held up a hand and said, "That is enough. We have a pattern here, and we need to address it." Tom called for a vote on removing the violations from my record. The motion passed 4-1, with Pamela as the only no vote. He called for a vote on the rule change requiring all violations to go through the portal with timestamps and cure periods before escalation. The motion passed 5-0. Pamela abstained. Tom said the board will also be conducting a review of the landscaping committee structure and voting on whether to dissolve it and transition enforcement back to the management company. That vote will happen at the next meeting. Pamela stood up and said, "You cannot dissolve a committee without cause." Tom said, "We have cause. You overstepped your authority, retaliated against a resident, and coordinated with a management employee to suppress appeals. That is more than enough cause." The room went silent. Pamela gathered her papers and walked toward the door. She stopped next to my chair and said, "Your camera does not matter. My minutes are the truth." I stood up and said, "Actually, the recorded minutes from the last 6 months never mention any of the violations you claimed were voted on." I checked. Tom confirmed that with the secretary before this meeting. "So your minutes are not the truth. They are fiction." She stared at me for 3 seconds and then walked out. The room stayed silent for another beat, and then Rick started clapping. A few other neighbors joined in. Tom banged the gavel and said, "Let us keep this professional. We have more business to cover." After the meeting, Tom pulled me aside and said, "The audit is going to take another 2 weeks, but based on what you presented today, I expect the management company will recommend terminating Pamela from any HOA leadership role. The board will vote on it at the next meeting. In the meantime, if she contacts you again, do not engage. Forward everything to me and I will handle it." I thanked him and left. Sandra caught up with me in the parking lot and said, "That was the most satisfying thing I have seen in years." She has been terrorizing people for months, and nobody had the guts to stand up to her with proof. You did the whole neighborhood a favor. The audit results came back 3 weeks later. The management company found that Brenda Holloway had deleted over 60 resident dispute uploads across a 2-year period, all related to landscaping violations issued by Pamela Mitchell. The audit also found that Pamela had issued 23 violation notices without board approval, 14 of which were based on misinterpretations of the bylaws or the recorded plat. The management company recommended that the board remove Pamela from all committee rules. and bar her from holding any leadership position for 5 years. They also recommended refunding all fees collected from the affected violations, which totaled over $8,000 across the neighborhood. Tom called an emergency board meeting to vote on the recommendations. The motion passed 4-0, with one board member recusing because they had served on the landscaping committee with Pamela. Pamela did not attend the meeting. The refund checks went out a month later. I got $200 back for fees I did not even know had been charged to my account. Rick got $300. Sandra got $400. The neighborhood group chat lit up with screenshots of refund letters and thank you messages. One neighbor posted, "This is what happens when someone actually fights back instead of just complaining." Another posted, "We should buy that guy a beer." Rick replied, "Already planning it." Pamela never posted in the chat again. Her access was revoked after the board vote. The new landscaping committee chair, a retired landscape architect named Ellen, reached out to me a few weeks later and said, "I reviewed your rocks case. The site plan is clear and the title report is definitive. The rocks stay." I am also updating the committee guidelines so that all enforcement actions require a site inspection and photo documentation before any notice is issued. No more notices based on drive-by observations or neighbor complaints without verification. I thanked her and said that sounded like a reasonable process. She said, "It is what should have been in place from the start." Pamela ran that committee like her personal fiefdom, and nobody challenged her because she made it so exhausting to fight back. You changed that. I ran into Pamela one more time, about 6 months after the board vote. I was walking into the clubhouse to drop off a package for a neighbor and she was walking out. She looked at me and said, "You can be mad, or you can be compliant." I said, "I was compliant. You just did not like it when I actually read the rules." She walked past me without another word. I never saw her at another meeting after that. Tom told me she sold her house a few months later and moved out of state. The new owner was a quiet, retired couple who never filed a single complaint. The HOA board implemented the new hearing rules 6 months later. The rules required all violations to be uploaded to the portal with timestamps, all disputes to be recorded in a public log, and all enforcement actions to be approved by a majority board vote before escalation. The rules also banned any committee chair from coordinating directly with vendors for enforcement without written board authorization. Tom said the changes were inspired by the audit findings and the pattern of abuse cases that came to light after my presentation. He said, "You did not just fix your own problem. You fixed a systemic issue that was hurting the whole community. That is leadership." Rick threw a small barbecue at his place a few weeks after the rules passed. He invited me, Sandra, and a few other neighbors who had been targeted by Pamela. We sat around his patio table and swapped stories. Sandra said, "I still have the fake violation notice she sent me. I keep it as a reminder that you should never let someone bully you just because they have a title." Rick said, "The best part was when she insisted it was an easement issue, and you pulled out the recorded plat and proved it was not. She had nothing left after that." The room went quiet, and then we all started laughing. It felt good to laugh about something that had been so stressful for so long. The most satisfying moment came a year later when the annual meeting rolled around. The board opened nominations for the landscaping committee, and Ellen was re-elected unanimously. Pamela was not even on the ballot. During the open forum, a new resident asked about the enforcement process and Tom walked through the new rules step by step. He said, "We learned some hard lessons about accountability and transparency. These rules are here to make sure no resident ever feels railroaded again." The room applauded. I sat in the back and did not say anything. I did not need to. The system was fixed, the records were clean, and the neighborhood was better for it. I still live in Canyon Springs. I still get the occasional red-stamped final notice envelope, but now it is for things like annual dues and meeting reminders, not fabricated violations. I still work long shifts and come home tired, but I do not come home to harassment anymore. The tow truck never came back. The portal works now. The neighborhood group chat is actually useful again, full of posts about lost pets and garage sale announcements instead of selective screenshots and witch hunts. Every once in a while, someone new moves in and asks about the HOA enforcement process, and a neighbor will say, "It is strict but fair now. It was not always that way. But someone fought back and fixed it." I keep the evidence binder in my closet. I do not look at it often, but it is there if I ever need it. My IT friend still checks the portal audit log every few months, just to make sure the auto-delete function has not come back. So far, it has not. Ellen runs the landscaping committee like a professional. Site inspections, photo documentation, clear timelines, and no surprises. She sends me a courtesy email every time my address comes up in a routine inspection, even when there is no issue. She said, "Transparency builds trust." I learned that from watching what happens when you do not have it. The one thing that stuck with me the most was not the board vote or the refund check or even the rule changes. It was the moment when Pamela repeated her catchphrase, "Your camera does not matter. My minutes are the truth," and I realized that she believed it. She genuinely thought her word was enough, that the rules did not apply to her, and that nobody would ever check her work. That is the dangerous part. Not the malice, but the arrogance. The belief that authority is the same as accountability. It is not. Authority without accountability is just bullying with a title. I learned that the hard way. And I made sure the board learned it too. The Canyon Springs Association still sends out red-stamped final notice envelopes, but now they are backed by real violations, real procedures, and real accountability. The HOA changes hearing rules so residents cannot be railroaded, and the new rules have teeth. Every notice goes through the portal with a timestamp. Every dispute gets logged. Every enforcement action requires a board vote. Karen is outvoted so hard the room laughs, and the funny karma beat is that Karen insists it is an easement issue, and the recorded plat disproves it, right there in front of everyone. The payback vector was a tow vendor refusing to act without proper authorization, and that set the tone for everything that followed. No vendor, no enforcement, no leverage. I appreciate you being part of this.